Hello everyone, this is Dr. Camara Jones. I'm delighted to be joining you at your conference where you're exploring the gray area of disparity. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. I am running myself ragged, but it was important for me to be able to share with you some of my thoughts about some of the root causes of health disparities. Many of you may know that my work is focused on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. And indeed, last year when I was president of the American Public Health Association, I launched our association and as many partners and community members as want to join us, because it's ongoing, in a national campaign against racism, where the three tasks are to name racism, to ask how is racism operating here, and then to organize and strategize to act. I know that you all have each on the individual level completed the implicit association test in IAT, which provides a measure of preference, racial preference at the individual level, what people are describing as implicit bias or unconscious bias. And many of you may be surprised at the results of that test. And so tests like that are important as a sort of wake-up call, even at the individual level, that we might be affected by racism in ways that we don't even understand or wouldn't even imagine. But in addition to understanding individual ways of having absorbed the negative messages of this society, it is important for us to, if we're going to do something about racism, recognize that it's a system. That racism is not an individual character flaw, it's not a personal moral failing, it's not even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, but it's a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of both structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race in this country. Now you look at me here in this video, and in most places in the country, in the US, you would interpret me as a light-skinned black woman. I would be clearly black. But did you know that in some parts of Brazil, I would be just as clearly white? And that in South Africa, I would be just as clearly colored? And so here I am, same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in three different settings would assign me to three different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would become that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all three places. So that's what race is, this social interpretation of how one looks in our race-conscious society. And racism is the system that operates on race to both structure opportunity and assign value. What are the impacts of this system? Well, when we do recognize racism is happening, we get to the point of understanding that it's unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities, and that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country. Indeed, it makes some people uncomfortable. And I'm not trying to make anybody in listening distance uncomfortable, but if we have to be uncomfortable, shake it off, because it's real. And I think I'll have time to share one story that will make it easy for you to talk about those things. But even as we recognize, okay, we have the unfair disadvantage and then the reciprocal unfair advantage, racism is also sapping the strength of our whole society through the waste of human resources. There are many examples of that in this country. I'm just going to lift up two very briefly. The first is how we as a nation are not yet vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our children, because the blinders of racism have made some people believe that there's no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. You know, we can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. But of course, there is genius in all of our communities, and if we were to only fully and vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. Might already be up on Mars farming, if that were a good idea, if we were to invest in all that genius. Another huge impact that these blinders that don't value all of us equally have, that's sapping the strength of the whole society, is how it has made us as a nation complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system. Is that didn't separate us from human potential. And if you know any folks stuck in the prisons or cycling in and out, you know there are many geniuses caught up in this system that if there were only some other way could be contributing quite productively to our society. Before I leave that definition of racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on so-called race that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources, I want to say one more thing, which is that in this country right now, people who can understand disadvantage often say, but why are you talking about advantage? Many people in this country think there is disadvantage and normal. And the reason that they think that is because we are ahistorical in this country. And people do not realize that their normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. Now, that definition I just provided of racism can actually be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So you can say, what is sexism? Well, that's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today, intersecting in communities and in individuals. So, the axes of inequity include gender and sexual orientation, geography, religion, language, nationality or citizen status in the U.S., many, many, many axes of inequity. So you might ask me, well, Dr. Jones, if you recognize that, why are you spending all your time talking about racism? And so I want to be clear on this. Racism is foundational in our nation's history and continues to have profound impacts on the health and well-being of the whole nation, even as many people are in denial of its continued existence. And so we must name racism. We must ask, how is racism operating here? We must organize and strategize to act on racism, even as we can organize and strategize on any of these other systems of inequity. And honestly, when we get things right around racism, some of the others might take care of themselves. I wanted to just, say, if there were something, if you were to ask me, isn't it too hard to dismantle racism? Like, what are you talking about, Dr. Jones? We're diabetes-oriented folks. We're trying to eliminate diabetes health disparities. And you're talking to me about racism? Isn't it like a cloud? Isn't it something I can't get my handle on? And to that I have to say no. Racism is a system, as I said, with identifiable and addressable mechanisms which are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which are different elements of decision making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision making. Who's at the table and who's not? What's on the agenda and what's not? And with these structures, I'm going to encourage each of you, when you find yourself at a decision-making table, your first job is going to have to be to look around and say, who is not here at this table who has an interest in this proceeding? And then your job is not just to represent their interest, but your job actually is to find them a way to the table. So if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making. And again, we need to develop the discipline of seeing the absence of. Not only review the policies that are on the book, but what policies have put in place could make things better here. And then if policies are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making. Who gets named to a committee or tapped for that role? Sometimes that's harder for us to figure out what's going on there, but we must. And then values are the why of decision-making. And I used to be, thinking values was philosophy or religion. But values are very important for us to address. I know many of you may or may not be familiar with my Gardener's Tale allegory. I believe that there's going to be a copy of that 4-page paper available for you to read. But for those who are familiar with the Gardener's Tale already, I'm going to jump to a punchline here, which is, even if we were to compel that gardener to enrich the poor rocky soil until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil, If that gardener continued to prefer red over pink, that gardener will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So it's not just about the opportunity structures, the quality of the soil that I used to always focus on, but we also need to address that gardener's initial preference for red over pink, which set up the whole situation. That cultural racism, if you will, that white supremacist ideology in our context. We must address those values if we're going to set things right in this nation. So I hope that you have a wonderful conference. I'm so delighted that I'm at least able to participate with you at this level. And I hope that you will not feel intimidated by the big questions. It's not something you have to do on your own. We are in a collective here, and together we can. Thank you very much.